Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 15, Thomas Jefferson didn't understand the game he was cheerleading. Jefferson was not someone whose military advice should be taken seriously. But that's how militia as terrorism extremists take Jefferson's quotes about a little rebellion being a good thing, and how his tree of liberty must be watered with other people's blood. The extremists take it as expert military advice that should be followed. The extremists take these quotes as expert testimony about war and rebellion that should not be contested. But when it came to war, Jefferson was no expert. Jefferson wasn't even a student. One might say that Jefferson fiddled while France burned. Except Jefferson was handing out matches and gasoline to every Frenchman he met. In the end, Jefferson was, at most, a cheerleader for war, who had no idea how war actually worked. Jefferson ran away from his one chance to fight the British, and became known as the Coward of Carter's Mountain for it. In some minds, this would disqualify him from ever giving advice on the subject of war. If that was insufficient, then Jefferson's naive cheerleading for the French Revolution should make his disqualification complete. While Jefferson was minister to France, he encouraged the French to revolt against King Louis XVI, the King of France without whom the American Revolution would have been crushed by the British. Jefferson invited French rebel leaders to his residence in Paris, and encouraged them to war. By July of 1789, he succeeded, when the French stormed the Bastille. And 2 months later, Jefferson left France for America. During Washington's presidency, 1789 to 1797, Washington was concerned that the bloody French Revolution would drag young America into France's wars across Europe. The colonies had signed a treaty of mutual military support with King Louis XVI. With the king overthrown, Washington thought the treaty was void. Most of his cabinet agreed. Except for Jefferson. Jefferson wanted the U.S. to go to war in support of the French revolutionaries as their wars spilled across Europe. When Washington warned against entangling alliances, he was talking about the French Revolution dragging the U.S. into an endless war. Because of the French Revolution, France ended up fighting Great Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, Russia, and several other monarchies. The battles spanned across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, the Indian subcontinent, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The wars sparked by the French Revolution led to the deaths of more than 100,000 Frenchmen, and perhaps 100,000 non-French people. The American Revolution, in contrast, resulted in 7,000 Americans killed in action over the entire course of the war. This isn't to downplay the sacrifice by Americans, but to highlight the vast difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. When the colonies revolted against the King of England, their first form of government was the Articles of Confederation. By the time the war with England was over, the U.S. was in a precarious position. The inability to collect taxes led to hyperinflation, and a horrible economy, which then led to Shays' Rebellion. The nation as a whole responded to Shays' Rebellion by creating the Constitution, which has remained the core design of the U.S. government for 2.5 centuries. By comparison, the French Revolution started with the storming of the Bastille in 1789. Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was adopted by the National Constituent Assembly in 1789. The French Constitution of 1791 created a National Assembly as legislative body, and gave the king veto power. The National Convention established the First French Republic in September of 1792. Paris saw food riots and mass hunger that winter. King Louis XVI was beheaded January of 1793. The convention then created the Committee of Public Safety to deal with food shortages, riots, radical movements, and revolts. This allowed the Jacobins' rise to power as it morphed into the Reign of Terror, with 300,000 French people arrested, and death sentences ordered for 16,000. The Reign of Terror ended in 1794, and was followed by the White Terror, which killed about 1,000 Jacobins. In 1795, the Constitution of the Year 3 was adopted. In 1797, Royalists gained 87 seats in the Directory, and anti-Royalists launched a coup. Paris was put under martial law with the decree that anyone supporting the royalists would be shot without trial. This was followed by the bloodless coup of 30 Prairial 7 in 1799. And then that same year, the coup of 18 Brumaire, which overthrew the Directory and created the French consulate, with Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul. Bonaparte attempted to legitimize his rule with Constitution of the Year 8, which created yet another constitution and yet another redesign of French government, but basically vested all power with Bonaparte. Then for good measure, Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of France in 1804. The world witnessed the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815, where Bonaparte waged war across the globe, resulting in the deaths of over 4 million people. Bonaparte was defeated in 1813 and exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He escaped in 1815 and took control of France again. He was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, and exiled to the much more remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died 6 years later. The American Revolution saw two different forms of government. The Articles of Confederation and then Shays' Rebellion caused the founders to create and ratify the Constitution. The U.S. then saw the Whiskey Rebellion rise up, but it did not cause a change in the design of U.S. government. And the U.S. government was relatively stable for nearly a century until the Civil War. The French Revolution had numerous factions fighting among themselves for power, and saw multiple coups or revolts or massacres that forced the government to change again and again and again, over the short span of 20 or so years. The American Revolution resulted in a representative form of government, and a somewhat isolationist country. The French Revolution resulted in Bonaparte declaring himself Emperor of France, waging war against the world. It never even occurred to Jefferson that his incitement of the French people to revolt might go sideways. Or if it did occur to him, he didn't care enough to find a different path. In January of 1793, Jefferson wrote to William Short, who had criticized the Jacobins, the group behind France's reign of terror, as violent. Jefferson defended the Jacobins saying, "The tone of your letters had for some time given me pain, on account of the extreme warmth with which they censured the proceedings of the Jacobins of France. I consider that sect the same with the Republican patriots." Jefferson goes on to downplay the blood in the streets. "Was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood? My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country, left free, it would be better than as it now is." This shows how much of a militant extremist Jefferson was. Jefferson said he was willing to murder and martyr every person on the planet but two per country rather than not have the French Revolution that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and created the vacuum in which Emperor Bonaparte rose to power, resulting in the deaths of millions. Jefferson was not merely willing to destroy the village to save it, he was willing to destroy the entire world to defend the bloody French Revolution that made Bonaparte an emperor. When Jefferson ran for president in the election of 1800, some opponents called him a Jacobin, the populists who used mob rule to create the Reign of Terror. Washington had been an actual general in the American Revolution, had seen the realities and brutalities of war, and didn't have Jefferson's naivete and eagerness for bloodshed. In April of 1793, President Washington announced his neutrality policy. Jefferson was so upset with the neutrality policy that he resigned from Washington's administration that year. In France, the Committee of Public Safety was established in April of 1793. Robespierre was added to the committee in July of 1793 and by December, Robespierre had established himself as dictator. The Jacobins were brutal with power. Terror became official French government policy. And even in the face of all this brutality, Jefferson still defended the Jacobins. Then in February of 1794, the French National Convention, led by Robespierre, saw the slaves revolting in the French colony of Haiti and declared slavery to be illegal in France and all its colonies. In July of 1784, Robespierre was beheaded as the White Terror began. In October of 1794, Jefferson wrote in a letter to Henry Remsen about the deaths of Robespierre and his bloodthirsty satellites. During his lifetime, Jefferson was an ardent supporter of the French Revolution, downplaying its bloodiness and justifying its violence. One of the few, rare times that Jefferson could bring himself to criticize anyone involved with the French Revolution, he criticized the man who declared slavery illegal in France and its colonies. It seems that slavery explains Jefferson's motivations more than his words about the importance of rebellion or his quotes about someone else dying to water his tree of liberty, or his words about all men being equal, or his words about liberty. Slavery, it seems, explains Jefferson more than anything. Jefferson is probably most famous for the principles he espouses in the opening of the Declaration of Independence, the principles that all men are created equal, and that all men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Jefferson didn't even come up with these principles. He plagiarized them from others. In 1690, John Locke wrote that men are born equal and have a right to life, liberty, and property. In 1748, Baron de Montesquieu wrote, "All men are born equal. Society makes them lose it, and they recover it only by the protection of the law." In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, "However unequal in strength and intelligence, men become equal by covenant and by right." In 1765, Voltaire wrote, "Equality is therefore both the most natural of things." In 1776, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the opening of which plagiarized from the above sources, stating that all men are created equal and that men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The rest of the document is a lawyer's list of accusations against the King of England, most of which no one remembers. The thing people remember most about the Jefferson's Declaration of Independence are words that didn't come from Jefferson. And while Jefferson plagiarized the idea of all men are created equal and the idea that all men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson didn't seem to hold these words as some sort of underlying principle guiding his own behavior. By 1774, Jefferson had inherited 175 slaves from his father and father-in-law. Despite owning so many slaves, Jefferson wrote all men are equal and that all men have a right to life and liberty in the 1776 Declaration of Independence. By 1792, he boasted how profitable it was to breed slaves like cattle and sell the children. "I shall presently take credit 4% per annum, for their increase over and above keeping up their own numbers." As president, Jefferson pushed for the act prohibiting the importation of slaves of 1807. This prohibited slaves to be imported into the U.S. from outside sources. While some point to this as evidence that Jefferson was trying to slow slavery, the law actually made it more profitable to breed slaves domestically, which Jefferson boasted about 13 years later. In 1820 Jefferson wrote, "I consider a slave woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best slave man of the farm." Jefferson sold more than 100 slaves for profit. He also gifted 85 slaves to family members. During his entire lifetime, Jefferson purchased less than 20 slaves. The rest he inherited or bred like cattle. Jefferson found the benefits of slavery to be more than just monetary. Possibly starting as early as 1787 through 1808, possibly longer, Jefferson repeatedly raped one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. It is considered rape because slave owners could legally kill a slave who refused their sexual advances, meaning Sally Hemings had no real choice in the matter, and also because when this started, Sally was 14 or 15 years old to Jefferson's 44 years of age. Jefferson ended up fathering 6 children with his slave, Sally Hemings. Jefferson raised his children born from Sally as slaves. During his lifetime, Jefferson only freed 2 slaves, Sally's 2 brothers. Upon his death, Jefferson's will freed his 4 surviving children that Sally had borne. Sally herself died still a slave. Whatever Jefferson might have said about liberty and equality, Jefferson's actions appeared to do whatever most profited Jefferson. And the primary source of Jefferson's profit was Jefferson's slaves. Jefferson said all men are created equal but wrote that blacks were inferior. Jefferson wrote all have the right to liberty, but raped his slave, Sally Hemings, for years and fathered 6 children with her. Jefferson said all men have the right to the pursuit of happiness, but enslaved 600 human beings, including his own children born by Sally Hemings. Jefferson said if the government does not protect these rights, the people have the right to throw off the government, but he did everything he could to prevent 500,000 enslaved Haitians from winning their freedom. Jefferson was a slave-holding white supremacist who took every opportunity to prolong slavery. When Jefferson wrote about a little rebellion being a good thing, Jefferson owned 100 slaves. When Jefferson wrote about watering his tree of liberty with someone else's blood, 44-year-old Thomas Jefferson was raping his 14-year-old slave girl Sally Hemings. She would give birth to Jefferson's first child at the age of 16. Is it any surprise that a white supremacist like Timothy McVeigh would hold Thomas Jefferson in the same high regard as John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln? Is it any surprise that many of the militia as terrorism extremists who quote Jefferson's A Little Rebellion and Tree of Liberty are white supremacists themselves? Is it any surprise that the majority of domestic terrorism in the U.S. today is driven by white supremacists? From 1774 onward, Jefferson profited greatly from owning slaves. But from that point forward, the abolition movement was born in the colonies, and only grew stronger, all while Jefferson's slave holdings grew too. In 1775, Thomas Paine wrote an article titled African Slavery in America. It was one of the first published articles calling for the abolition of slavery. Between 1780 and 1804, all the northern states passed laws that abolished slavery. Across the Atlantic, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in Britain in 1787. Jefferson was born into a world where slavery was legal and global. By the time he died, Jefferson saw slavery outlawed in all the northern states, Canada, Mexico, United Kingdom, Spain, France, Portugal, Greece, Sweden, and Norway, among others. Jefferson saw slavery would be coming to an end in the United States and he did everything in his power to prolong slavery. It should not be surprising that as early as 1776 that slave states were for states' rights and against a strong federal government that could outlaw slavery and execute that law in force. It should not be surprising that in the midst of this budding abolition movement, that a man like Jefferson who profited so greatly from slavery would advocate for a weak central government and advocate against the Constitution. The word slave does not appear in the Constitution, but it is implied 3 times, the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and a prohibition against outlawing the slave trade for at least 20 years. These clauses did not just pop into existence from nowhere, rather they were the results of delegates at the Constitution Convention arguing between abolitionists and slave states. This was the nation's primary debate: were all men created equal? Or was it just a sham to enrich white slave owners? When Jefferson saw the nation reacting to Shays' Rebellion by wanting a stronger central government, he knew the abolitionists would be driving for the power to outlaw slavery. And Jefferson tried to downplay the threat that was its motivation: Shays' Rebellion. Jefferson said a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. He said the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of patriots. Jefferson also argued that a chief magistrate, i.e. president, would abuse their power. None of the words that Jefferson said in 1787 in downplaying Shays' Rebellion, none of his words did he hold true to. None of his words about a little rebellion, about watering his tree of liberty, about how rulers should be mild in their punishments of rebellions, about his complaints about chief magistrate, about his concerns for abuse of power, none of these Jefferson's words match Jefferson's actions at any point in his life. If these words reflect a direct underlying principle, Jefferson violated every single one of those principles during his lifetime. Jefferson talked tough about a little rebellion and watering his tree of liberty with the blood of patriots, but when he was commander-in-chief in Virginia, facing a British invasion, he packed his bags and ran away. Jefferson said a little rebellion every 20 years was a good thing and he didn't like the Constitution's idea of president as chief magistrate, but almost exactly 20 years after defending Shays' Rebellion, Jefferson abused the power of chief magistrate and nearly broke the government trying to convict Burr of treason. None of the things Jefferson said in defense of Shays' Rebellion makes sense when compared to Jefferson's own actions before or after Shays' Rebellion. But everything Jefferson said in defense of Shays' rebellion makes sense if Jefferson didn't actually care about Shays and his rebellion at all, but rather everything Jefferson wrote in 1787 about Shays, everything he wrote about his Tree of Liberty and a little rebellion being a good thing, everything makes complete sense if read from the point of view of a slave owner in fear of the Constitutional Convention creating a strong federal government and the growing abolitionist movement coming together to take away his slaves, his primary money maker, and his bed warmer Sally Hemings. So, while Jefferson is famous for espousing the ideas of liberty and equality, those ideas are not his own. He plagiarized them from others. And while Jefferson wrote about liberty and equality, he owned hundreds of slaves. While Jefferson wrote that men had the right to rebel to fight for life, liberty, and equality, he worked to keep 500,000 rebelling Haitians in chains. Jefferson tried to suppress the Haitian Revolution because his only concern was that the rebellion of Haitian slaves might encourage Jefferson's own slaves to revolt. While Jefferson said a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, he nearly broke the checks and balances of the government to convict Burr of treason for alleged rebellion. While Jefferson spoke of the virtues of small government, he abused every power as president, committing multiple acts of obstruction of justice, attempting to convict his former vice president of treason. Those are not the actions of a man driven by the principles of equality and liberty. After the Constitution was ratified, Jefferson worked within Washington's cabinet to attempt to weaken the government. Alexander Hamilton was also on Washington's cabinet, and Jefferson frequently accused Hamilton of being a monarchist, of wanting to turn the U.S. into a monarchy. Some suggest that Jefferson's blind support of the bloody French Revolution was Jefferson's hope to prove that the anarchy of the French Revolution could succeed as a form of government, that the French Revolution was Jefferson's proxy war against Hamilton, trying to prove that Hamilton's push for a strong central government was unnecessary and wrong. But after the French Revolution brought 10 years of anarchy, after the Reign of Terror, and the White Terror, after one massacre in France after another, after multiple coups, after the French government changing its form again and again and again, many French people cheered the rise of Emperor Bonaparte and the death of democracy and the death of millions. Rather than admit his mistake in blindly cheering the French to a revolt that eventually killed millions, rather than admit he was wrong in his willingness to martyr half the world, rather than admit he was wrong all the times he downplayed the violence and bloodshed, Jefferson instead blamed the French. In 1823, Jefferson wrote that the French were not qualified, that they had not been ready, to make the transition from despotism to freedom. In 1821, Jefferson, who had spent most of his life arguing for weak government, arguing against a strong central government, went back on his word again when the alternative was admitting he had made a mistake. Jefferson wrote that the French Revolution would have succeeded had they kept their king in some limited form, that a partial monarchy would have prevented the power vacuum that led to anarchy that eventually led to Bonaparte's rise to power. Placed the king in his station, investing him with limited powers, which I verily believe he would have honestly exercised, according to the measure of his understanding. In this way no void would have been created. After a lifetime demonizing his political enemies as monarchists, Jefferson said the French Revolution would have been better off with a partial monarchy. After years of demonizing his political opponents as wannabe kings, Jefferson somehow found the solution to the French Revolution to be a king. And Jefferson managed to do this without acknowledging how he had just contradicted every word he had said his entire life. On top of it all, this shows Jefferson's attempt to rewrite history. Because the first thing the French did when they had their revolution, the very first form of government they tried had made the king part of the government design, giving him veto power. The king did have limited powers at first. But people were starving and the French beheaded him because they wanted a scapegoat. Jefferson's view of war was naive and based on a complete lack of experience with war. Jefferson's view of war had nothing to do with the realities that come with the fog of war, and everything to do with Jefferson's fantasy of how wars will go exactly how he wants them to go. Jefferson had zero understanding of the concept of unintended consequences that comes from toppling regimes and creating power vacuums. Jefferson's role with regard to war would not be as strategist or advisor, since he had zero understanding of how war actually worked, zero understanding of how little of a war is within your control, and zero understanding of how war can go horribly wrong. Jefferson's role with regard to war would best be described as a cheerleader, on the sidelines, who does not himself know the rules of the game, but nevertheless yells chants like "You can do it, it's not that bad, you'll be welcomed as liberators, 6 more months and this whole thing will turn around." Jefferson's words about war have all the strategic relevance of someone shouting, "Hold up, wait a minute. Let me put some spirit in it. People of France, break it down. Knock this monarchy out of town." And then when things went horribly wrong, as people who had actually played the game feared, rather than admit his ignorance of the matter, rather than admit his mistakes, rather than admit he was actually wrong, Jefferson blamed the people whose blood was spilled, and attempted to rewrite history. Jefferson's naivete about war might be comparable to President George W. Bush responding to the 9/11 attacks by invading the wrong country. Iraq, based on false intel about weapons of mass destruction, while telling the world we would be welcomed as liberators, that we'd be in and out in 6 months, that the number of troops required would be small, and that the war would pay for itself. In reality, the only WMDs ever found were the ones that Hans Blix had been methodically cataloging and destroying until the US invaded. American troops in Iraq peaked at 170,000, American troops were there for nearly a decade, cost America $1 trillion, and the toppling of Saddam created a power vacuum that led to years of civil war and the birth of ISIS. And when the systemic torture of prisoners of war at Abu Ghraib and other black sites came to light, everyone who had pushed for the invasion, they all downplayed the war crimes that had been committed on an industrial scale. Alternatively, Jefferson might be the founder's version of Vice President Dick Cheney. Cheney knew Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But Cheney owned 660,000 shares of the oil company Halliburton. And Cheney knew he could turn those shares into a lot of money if he could get Halliburton into Iraq. The 9/11 attacks were planned by Al-Qaeda from inside Afghanistan, but there was no oil in Afghanistan. So, Cheney helped cook the October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate report that the CIA gave to Congress, creating a mountain of false intel, pointing the US at Iraq, becoming a cheerleader for an idiotic war. Jefferson might have been a blind cheerleader of the French Revolution, not because he cared about France or about anyone else, but because he was using it as a proxy war against Hamilton and the people in Washington's cabinet he considered monarchists. Jefferson wanted the anarchy of the French Revolution to show that a strong central government wasn't needed. Because those in favor of a strong central government had been fighting to take away his slaves, and the fight between abolitionist and slave states had already resulted in the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the slave importation clauses of the Constitution. In 1792, Jefferson boasted how profitable it was to breed slaves like cattle. In 1820 Jefferson boasted how profitable slave women were, bearing children he could sell into slavery. Halliburton made $40 billion on the Iraq War. Cheney's net worth peaked at $100 million, most of which came from Halliburton. Jefferson literally ran from the British. Cheney got 5 deferments from the Vietnam War. Both talked tough about war because they saw profit in it in some fashion. Yet neither of them ever fought in a war. At best, Jefferson was naive and gullible about rebellions and the French Revolution, the way Bush was naive and gullible about Iraq. At worst, Jefferson beat the drums of war others would fight because it benefited him in some way, regardless of the human cost to the world, the way Cheney beat the war drums for invading Iraq because it pushed his net worth to $100 million. Either way, both the French Revolution and the Iraq invasion ended in disaster. Both attempted regime changes that created power vacuums, and those power vacuums led to years of civil wars. And civil wars led to extremists rising to power. The war with Iraq created ISIS and killed hundreds of thousands. The French Revolution created Emperor Bonaparte and killed millions. And after the cheerleaders for war were proven wrong, they blamed everyone else and took no responsibility for their actions. Cheney died with a net worth of $100 million. Most of it from Halliburton. Jefferson died in 1826, still owning 200 slaves. Whether he was naive and gullible or ruthless and calculating, Jefferson is the absolute last person you should take military advice from. Jefferson is the absolute last person you should take advice from about whether rebellion is a good thing or not. Jefferson is the absolute last person you should take advice from about spilling the blood of patriots to fight tyranny. Jefferson was a cheerleader for war, but didn't know the least bit about how war actually worked. When you hear a little rebellion or tree of liberty, listen to it with the same level of absurdity as we will be welcomed as liberators. Jefferson said a little rebellion now and then is a good thing in the same letter that he said Shays' rebellion was honorably conducted. Jefferson said the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants in the same letter where he asked what signify a few lives lost. Jefferson wrote about this need to fight for liberty while owning 100 slaves and raping a 14-year-old slave girl. Perhaps you shouldn't be taking military advice from Jefferson given he was willing to martyr half the world for the French Revolution. I would have seen half the earth desolated were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country. Perhaps you shouldn't be taking military advice from Jefferson who was willing to destroy far more than the village to save it. Perhaps you shouldn't be taking military advice from a man who ran from defending his country from invasion, the coward of Carter's Mountain. More likely, both A Little Rebellion and Tree of Liberty quotes come from letters in which Jefferson defended and downplayed the threat posed by rebellions like Shays in an attempt to dissuade the rest of the nation from adopting the much stronger federal government as designed in the Constitution. Because Jefferson was fully aware of the abolitionist movement in America and knew of the fight over slavery in writing the Constitution. Most importantly, Jefferson's quotes do not reflect the founders' intentions, or the nation's intentions, for the Constitution and Second Amendment. Rather these letters are Jefferson lobbying against the Constitution and against a government strong enough to take his slaves. Jefferson espoused a great many principles like freedom and equality, like the importance of rebellion, like the need to fight to defend one's country. And Jefferson betrayed every single one of those principles in his lifetime to defend what most profited Jefferson, slavery. Jefferson said rebellion is a good thing and opposed the Constitution. And the rest of the United States said rebellion shall be treason and ratified that definition into the Constitution. The founders didn't merely disagree with Jefferson politically. Some detested Jefferson personally. Martha Washington described Jefferson as one of the most detestable of mankind, as the greatest misfortune our country has ever experienced. Treason is not the reason the founders wrote the Constitution and the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason the founders created militias. Treason is not the reason for the season.